63 years of independence, 63 years of promises, 63 years of patience. It's time for governance now. Governance now. Let's make it work.
First of all, this subject is a bit all-encompassing because on the one hand it talks about expectations, on the other hand it talks about governance. And I'm assuming that you're not just focusing on governance as a problem. It is a legitimate issue, and I mean certainly one could devote a whole session to it. But you know, I think, at least I read the introductory remarks as saying we need to look at what are the expectations, are we capable of meeting them? And obviously in that process, governance issues are extremely important, both because they limit the effectiveness of what you do if the governance isn't good enough, and they undermine the legitimacy of what is happening. I mean, this is a separate issue from efficiency, because you know, it's not enough to just have efficiency. A system has to have social legitimacy. And if there is a widespread perception that governance is seriously deficient, and you know, one good thing about a vigilant press is that there will always be that sort of spotlight put on government activity, then I think you need, independent of efficiency, you need to ensure that there is a perception that the governance also comes up to high standards. I mean, what I mean here is that, you know, it's not enough to say, well, you know, we've been aiming at high growth, we've got high growth, so what's your problem? Now, actually, Kamath said something about double-digit growth is sort of here, we can't get away from it. I'm not sure what he meant. The expectation of double-digit growth, very definitely. I believe that any government that fails to deliver close to double-digit, I'm hoping that if a government gets 9.8, Kamath will round it up to 10%. But you know, anything that is seriously away from double-digit will, in terms of performance, be counted as poor. And I'm sure that governments feed that, and it's certainly reflected in the targeting that we have been asked to do. And you know, we are currently working towards the 12th plan, and we hope that we will be able to produce a target of 10% and be credible in what is necessary to achieve that. Now, my view is that India can achieve 10%, but it would be a mistake to think that is going to happen anyway. The only thing is we've got to get the governance right, because you may get a 10%, but people may feel that governance is lacking. I believe that as a straight planning exercise of putting together the ingredients for 10%, we are not there. What I think has been demonstrated in the last several years is that the economy has a tremendous capability, which is reflected in the fact that growth rates have gone up. A lot of this is indeed private sector capability. A lot of this is a reflection of the success of government policy that has allowed the private sector the freedom and flexibility. Those who used to feel that without government direction, the economy would not do well, and that the private sector would not be able to invest, I mean, they surely now believe that that's not a problem. But in order to achieve 10%, I think there are three critical areas that the government has to concentrate on, which are both necessary for 10% and also, I think, necessary to ensure that the 10% is inclusive. This is, I mean, we often use the term inclusive growth. My view is that if you have an inclusive politics, and God knows that we have an inclusive politics, and thank God for it too, you cannot have anything other than an inclusive economics. You cannot have a democracy and have a growth process that is not inclusive. So this must be absolutely central. So what is it that we need to deliver? Number one, I think we have to do much better in the area of agriculture than we have done. Although I do want to say that we have done much better than we were doing earlier. I think when this government came in, you know, the long-term growth rate was down to 2%. We set a target of 10%, I mean 4%. We're not there yet. But I think by the time the 11th plan is over, we'll be somewhere between 3 and 3.5. That's still a little short of 4, but we ought to get to 4. And that raises a very large number of issues which usually are not discussed in industry circles because it's not part of industry's business. Although actually, in my view, the industry-agriculture interface has to be high and has to be much higher than it was earlier. I think we have to recognize that a 4% growth in agriculture is not going to take place because of food grains. Food grains need to grow by 2%. It's going to happen because non-food grains is going to grow between 6-7%. That growth cannot happen unless there is a major modernization of private contact with the farmer, improvements in logistics, and a whole lot of things which link up the growing urban economy with a more productive agricultural economy. So second thing is infrastructure. Now, you can have the best private sector in the world, and some of them, the very highly capital-intensive ones, can also produce their own infrastructure. I mean, they can certainly produce their own power plants if it's a very capital-intensive industry. But you're not going to achieve double-digit growth in manufacturing without a very substantial base of small and medium enterprise, and actually small enterprise becoming bigger. And that cannot happen unless the quality of our infrastructure matches what seems to exist in many other developing countries. We are far from that. That is a very high priority, and that requires very active involvement by the government. So that is the second big area. Of course, the third, everybody has mentioned it, health and education and skill development. I mean, these are things also that the government has to spend money on, although it's not necessarily clear that the government has to be the provider of services. Now, actually, we are experimenting in that area. For example, in health. In health, for the poor, this government has introduced something called the Rashtriya Swasth Bima Yojana, which is essentially a health insurance scheme for the BPL population. So if you assume that the BPL population is about 400 million people, roughly, everybody who is in the BPL category can get himself or herself a white card, which basically assures them cashless treatment for a defined list of health problems in either a government hospital or a private hospital. The state government and the central government pay the insurance. And it is not that we are setting up only government service providers. We are actually financing the consumer to be able to buy health services and giving the consumer the choice of going either to a public hospital or to a private hospital. So that's an example where the government is spending the money. Actually, they're spending 100% of the money. But both the public and the private service providers compete for the business that has been created. Now, that's not the model we are using, for example, in education. I mean, in education, private sector schools are allowed to exist, but government funding only goes to public sector schools. So there are people who have been doing on a pilot basis a voucher system, for example, which would basically say that, look, the public sector system involves X amount of expenditure per child, and any child who wants to go to any school, which is a registered school, can actually get a scholarship of that amount. So they can either go to a public sector school or they can go to a private. This leads to huge, it is being tried experimentally. We in the Planning Commission have not actually endorsed this as an approach because there's a lot of resistance to it. So when we are looking at experimental ways of delivery, I think these are issues that need to be addressed. There's absolutely no doubt that the Right to Education Act was a long awaited, something that should have been done even earlier. I mean, the constitutional amendment was brought in a long time ago, but the law that would implement the constitutional amendment has only been passed and become effective on April 1 of this year.